My name is Catherine and I'm 34 years old. 2 weeks ago, I stood in a cemetery chapel holding a deed that proved my father's burial plot was sold to a stranger 10 years before he died. The funeral director said it was a clerical error. The stranger's family said they paid cash, and my mother, she's been lying about where she visits every Sunday for 2 decades. This isn't about a headstone, it's about who gets to claim the dead. I'm Catherine, and here's what I found that afternoon. That folded document wasn't just a plot deed. It was a receipt dated 10 years before my father died, signed by someone he never met. The cemetery records show no transfer. The county clerk shows no filing, but the woman who bought it has been visiting that grave every Mother's Day for 9 years. My mother never told me she wasn't visiting my father's grave, she was visiting a stranger's. And the real question isn't where my father is buried. It's who decided that a living person could sell a dead man's final address without anyone noticing. My father died on a Tuesday in November just after the leaves turned. I was 23, he was 57, heart attack in the garage, a wrench still in his hand. My mother handled everything. The funeral, the headstone, the burial plot at St. Catherine's Memorial Gardens. She said she picked the spot herself, a quiet corner under an oak tree because my father loved the shade. For 10 years, I believed her. Every Mother's Day, every Father's Day, every anniversary, I drove with her to that grave. She would stand in front of the headstone, touch the name engraved in granite and cry, not loud, just a single tear tracing the same path down her cheek each time. I thought it was grief, I thought it was love, I thought I understood what it meant to lose someone, but I didn't understand anything. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September when I found the envelope. My mother had asked me to clean out the attic. She said she was finally ready to let go of my father's old work papers. I pulled down a cardboard box labeled Garage Receipts 2005-2010. Inside were tax documents, insurance forms, and a yellow manila folder pressed flat at the bottom. No label, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was a deed of transfer for a burial plot at St. Catherine. The grantee was a woman named Margaret Holloway. The date was March 9, 2008. That was 2 years before my father died. My father was still alive in March of 2008. He was still mowing the lawn, still telling bad jokes at dinner, still alive. And someone had already sold his grave. I called my mother, she didn't answer. I called again, voicemail. I drove straight to her house, the deed still in my hand. She was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a novel, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She looked up when I walked in, she saw my face, she saw the paper. And then she did something I had never seen my mother do in 34 years. She closed the book and told the truth, but only part of it. She said the plot had been sold by the cemetery, a clerical error. They sold the same plot twice. The other family, the Holloways, were told they had a valid deed. The cemetery offered my father a different plot 1 row over under a different tree. He accepted. He never told me, she said. He didn't want me to worry. I stared at her. Then why didn't you tell me? She looked down at her tea. I didn't want you to think less of him. I didn't want you to think he was careless. But I saw her hands. They were trembling. And I knew, the way you know when someone is holding back a flood, that there was more. That night I called the cemetery office. The woman who answered gave me the standard line, records are sealed after 10 years. I asked for the director. She put me on hold. 3 minutes later, a man's voice came on. This is Arthur Pendleton, cemetery director. How can I help you? I told him about the deed, the duplicate sale, the plot my father supposedly accepted instead. There was a pause, then he said, Mrs. Holloway's plot is still active. She visits regularly. I asked about my father's plot. Another pause. He said, your father's plot, the one your mother visits, that plot belongs to a woman named Eleanor Vance, purchased in 2012. The line went cold. My father had no plot. My mother had been standing at a stranger's grave for 10 years. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled up county property records online, searched for St. Catherine's Memorial Gardens plot numbers, transfer histories, anything. The county website crashed twice. I called a land title company the next morning. They ran a search. What they found made no sense. The plot my mother visits was purchased by Eleanor Vance in 2012. Eleanor Vance died in 2009. 2009, she bought a grave 3 years after she died. That is impossible. Unless the signature on the deed was forged, unless someone used a dead woman's name to buy a plot 10 years ago, unless my mother is not the only person lying. I went back to the cemetery. This time I didn't call ahead. I walked into the main office, the deed from the yellow folder in my hand, and asked to see the original transfer for plot 47, section C. The clerk looked at the computer. She looked at me. She said that plot was transferred in 2008 from one name to another, but the original buyer, a man named Gerald Ouellette. The name hit me like a door closing. Gerald Ouellette, my father's full name. He bought the plot in 2005. He never sold it. The cemetery records say he did, but the signature on the transfer doesn't match any of his known documents. I pulled his will from probate court. His signature on the will is a full cursive G. The signature on the transfer is a block printed G. 2 different hands. Someone signed for him, and I know exactly who had access to his paperwork in 2008. The same person who asked me to clean out the attic last week. The same person who told me the story about the clerical error. The same person who has been standing at a stranger's grave for a decade, crying tears that never once landed on my father's name. I sat in my car outside my mother's house for 12 minutes before I got out. The deed was in my jacket pocket, folded so tight the crease lines had turned white. I knew if I walked in with accusations, she would retreat. She always retreated. So I tried a different angle. I called her on the phone. She answered on the second ring, casual, like any Sunday afternoon. I said, "Mom, I found something in that attic box. A deed for plot 47, section C. I just want to understand the timeline." She didn't speak for 4 full seconds. Then she said, "Come over, we'll talk." She was waiting at the kitchen table, same spot as before, but this time the tea was cold. She looked smaller, like the story she'd been carrying had been compressing her spine for years. She said, "I never meant for you to find that." I said, "I know, but I also know that the signature forging my father's name doesn't match his handwriting, and I know the woman whose grave you visit was dead for 3 years before the plot was transferred to her name." She started crying, not a soft single tear. The kind that pulls the whole body forward, elbows on the table, face in her hands, and I waited, because I needed her to tell me something I could believe. She told me the truth. My father had a gambling debt, not a small one, $147,000 by 2007. He'd been hiding it for years, pulling from the mortgage, borrowing from friends, writing checks from accounts my mother didn't know existed. He kept the books at the metal fabrication plant where he worked, and he'd been skimming from the petty cash fund for 3 years before anyone noticed. When the plant auditor caught it in September of 2007, my father was given a choice: repay the full amount or face criminal charges. He didn't have the money, he wasn't going to prison, so he made a deal with the plant owner, a man named Leonard Croft. Leonard would pay the debt. In exchange, my father would sign over the burial plot he'd bought in 2005. Leonard wanted it for his wife's family. My father signed the transfer. He signed it himself. But the problem was the plot had already been promised to his own mother, my grandmother, who had died the year before and was buried in a different cemetery. My father panicked. He told my mother he'd signed a fake deed using his brother's name to make it look like the transfer was invalid. He said Leonard would give up and the plot would stay in the family. But Leonard didn't give up. He hired a lawyer. The lawyer found the real deed, the one with my father's real signature, and filed it with the county. The plot was legally transferred in March of 2008. My father knew he'd lost it, but he never told my mother the full story. He told her the plot had been sold by mistake, that the cemetery had fixed it, that he'd gotten a different plot 1 row over. That was the lie he told her. And my mother believed it, or she wanted to believe it, because the alternative meant admitting her husband had lied to her for years. I said, "So when did you find out about the gambling debt?" She looked at me. "I always knew about the debt. I found the bank statements in 2006. I confronted him. He promised he'd stopped. He didn't stop. I covered for him. I lied to the bank, to his boss, to his mother. I thought if I protected him, he would change. He never changed. And when he died, I was so tired of carrying the weight that I just kept carrying it." I visited the empty plot because I didn't know where else to go. That headstone with his name on it, I paid for it myself. I had it installed in that plot, the one that wasn't his. The cemetery never checked. They never check. They just take the money. For 10 years, I've been standing at a stone that marks nothing but my own denial. I sat across from her, the kitchen clock ticking, the ice melting in the tea. I wanted to be angry, I wanted to scream. But all I felt was the cold weight of a decade of silent arrangement. She had been protecting my father's reputation, even in death, by lying to me, and I had been protecting her by believing. I took the deed out of my pocket and laid it flat on the table between us. I said, "Who is Eleanor Vance?" She blinked. "Who? Eleanor Vance, the woman whose name is on the plot you visit. She died in 2009, but the plot was transferred to her name in 2012. Who bought it for her?" My mother stared at the paper. She said, "I don't know. I never looked at the records. I swear I never looked. I just went to the headstone. I believed the stone." But not everyone leaves a paper trail. The headstone manufacturer had a receipt for the engraving. My mother paid cash. The cemetery had a record of the plot assignment, but no signature for the transfer. The county had a deed with Eleanor Vance's name, but the signature was block printed, same as the forged one on my father's transfer. 2 different documents, same handwriting. Someone had access to both my father's paperwork and the cemetery's filing system. Someone who could mimic a block-printed G on a deed in 2008 and a block-printed E on a deed in 2012. That someone wasn't my mother. She never block-printed anything in her life. She writes in loops. I pulled my father's old letters from a box in the attic. His handwriting was small, cursive, a low slant. The forged block-printed G on the 2008 transfer, it was the same block-printed E on the 2012 transfer, same hand, 2 different names. One person, and my mother was sitting across from me with a face that said she was about to hand me the missing piece. She said, "There's something else." Leonard Croft's daughter worked at the cemetery. She was the assistant director from 2006 to 2014. Her name was Margaret. I looked at the deed. The grantee on my father's plot was Margaret Holloway. I said, "Margaret Holloway is Leonard Croft's daughter." My mother nodded. "She married a man named Holloway in 2009. She changed her name. She was the one who processed the transfer. She wrote the block-printed signature. She knew my father's debt. She knew he had no legal recourse. She forged the deed for her own mother's grave. And then 3 years after my father died, she did it again. She used the name of a dead woman, Eleanor Vance, to purchase the plot my mother needed to bury her grief. She let my mother stand at an empty stone while her own mother's ashes were scattered in the garden behind the cemetery office. I found out later that Leonard Croft's mother was buried in a different state. The plot my mother believed was my father's was never meant for anyone. It was a ghost plot. A ledger entry with a fake name, a blank piece of land with a discounted headstone. I called Arthur Pendleton, the cemetery director, the next morning. I told him I had evidence of a forged transfer on my father's plot. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Mrs. Holloway no longer works here. She relocated in 2014. I have no knowledge of any irregularities during her tenure." I said, "Are you saying you're not going to investigate?" He said, "I'm saying that cemetery records are sealed after 10 years. You have no legal standing to demand access." I said, "I have a deed with a forged signature." He said, "You have a photocopy, and you have no way to prove who held the pen." Then he hung up. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and pulled the probate file for Eleanor Vance. She died in 2009, no will, no next of kin listed. Her estate was handled by the public administrator. The public administrator's name was Margaret Holloway, the same woman who forged my father's signature, who worked at the cemetery, who processed the deed to her own mother's name using a dead woman's identity. She had access to both the cemetery records and the probate office. She used a dead woman's name to buy a plot that my mother then claimed unknowingly for my father. My mother had been paying for a headstone on land that belonged to no one, and the woman who arranged it all was the daughter of the man who drove my father into debt. There is no statute of limitations on this kind of fraud, but there is a high wall of silence. The cemetery won't talk, the county won't release sealed records, and Margaret Holloway has been gone for a decade, but I have her name. I have the document, and I have one person left who might know where she went: my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Patricia, who worked at the same cemetery as a groundskeeper for 30 years. I dialed her number and the phone rang for so long I almost hung up. Then a voice old and thin said, "Catherine, I knew you. Call eventually. Your mother told me you found the deed. I have something for you, something I should have given you the day your father died, but I was afraid. I'm still afraid. Can you come over tonight? I'll leave the porch light on." Aunt Patricia's house sat at the end of a gravel road, the porch light flickering against a damp October night. She opened the door before I could knock. She looked older than I remembered, her hands rough from years of digging graves and trimming hedges. She led me to the kitchen without a word. On the table was a manila envelope worn at the edges, stained with something dark. She gestured for me to sit. I opened it. Inside were three things: a photocopy of a county check for $12,000 dated November 15, 2012, made out to St. Catherine's Memorial Gardens. The payer line said estate of Eleanor Vance, but the signature on the check belonged to Margaret Holloway, public administrator. Below it, a handwritten note: Plot 47C, no further inquiries. MH. The third item was a photograph, a woman I didn't recognize, smiling in a cemetery office, her hand resting on a filing cabinet. On the back, in pencil, Margaret Holloway, 2013. Aunt Patricia sat across from me, her eyes fixed on the table. She said, "I found these in the cemetery incinerator pile the day Margaret left. She was burning files. I pulled this one out because I recognized the check number. I'd written it myself. As groundskeeper, I handled the burial fee receipts. I knew every check that came through. This one was never supposed to exist." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The estate of Eleanor Vance had no money. I checked the probate file myself. The public administrator's office closed the estate with zero assets. There was no $12,000. Margaret created that check. She forged the signature of the probate judge. She cashed it into a cemetery account she controlled. Then she used that money to buy the plot for her own mother's remains. She stole from a dead woman to bury her mother, and she used your father's empty grave as the cover." The room went cold. I looked at the check again. The number was sequential, issued by the county, but the signature was shaky, a rushed imitation. I said, "How did she get away with it?" Aunt Patricia's voice dropped. "Because she wasn't alone. The cemetery director, Arthur Pendleton, knew. He signed the approval for the plot transfer. He was her supervisor. He covered for her. When she left in 2014, he gave her a glowing reference. She moved to Florida. She's working as a funeral director in a small town outside Tampa. She changed her name. She goes by Margaret Croft now. She never got caught because the one person who could report her, your mother, was too afraid to look." I said, "My mother didn't know." Aunt Patricia looked at me. "Your mother knew the plot was sold. She knew your father had the debt. She didn't know about Eleanor Vance. But she knew the plot she visited wasn't your father's. She chose not to ask, because asking would mean admitting your father's lie was bigger than she could bear. That silence is what Margaret depended on. It's what Arthur Pendleton counted on. It's what the entire system relies on. Grief makes people docile, and docile people don't check deeds." I thought about the headstone. My mother had paid for it. She had the name carved in granite. She had it placed on land that legally belonged to Eleanor Vance's non-existent estate. But Eleanor Vance never owned the plot. The plot was never transferred. It was a ghost entry. Margaret used the cemetery's own internal ledger to create a fake grant. Then she used the county's lack of oversight to file a fraudulent deed. And every year, when the cemetery sends tax bills to the address on file, they go to a post office box that Margaret set up. She's been paying the nominal annual fee from a bank account she opened under Eleanor Vance's name. She's been keeping the lie alive for 12 years. I asked my aunt, "Do you have a current address for Margaret Croft?" She nodded. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a slip of paper with a Florida address and a phone number. She said, "I've been carrying this for 9 years. I never had the courage to call. I was afraid of what I'd find. I took the paper, then I did call." The phone rang 4 times. A woman answered, professional, warm. "Croft Funeral Home, this is Margaret speaking. How can I help you today?" I said, "My name is Catherine. My father's name was Gerald Ouellette. You forged his signature on a burial plot transfer in 2008. You used a dead woman's name to buy that same plot in 2012. And you have been collecting grave fees under a false identity ever since. There was a long pause, then the line went dead. She hung up, but I had the address, and I had something else. Arthur Pendleton's number. I called the cemetery director the next morning. I said, Mr. Pendleton, I know you signed the plot transfer for a leaner Vance in 2012. I have a copy of the check. I have the photograph of Margaret in your office. I have your signature on the approval. I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth before I file a complaint with the state licensing board and the county prosecutor. He said, you don't understand the situation. I said, then explain it. He took a breath. He said, Margaret came to me in 2011. Her mother was dying. She had no money for a burial plot. She asked if there was any abandoned plot in the cemetery. I checked the records. There was plot 47, section C. It had been sold twice, once to your father, once to Leonard Croft's family, but no remains had ever been interred. Legally, it was considered dormant. I told Margaret she could use it temporarily. She took that as permission to transfer it permanently. She filed the paperwork. I should have stopped her. I didn't, because if I reported her, I would have to explain why I let a dormant plot sit for years without notifying the next of kin. That's a violation of state cemetery regulations. I would lose my license, so I stayed silent. I've stayed silent for 12 years. I said, you're still the director. You can still correct the record. He said, if I correct the record, I admit to a decade of fraud. I'll be fired. I'll be investigated. The cemetery could lose its accreditation. I said, and my mother's 10 years of grief? He said, your mother's grief is real. The plot is not. But the grief is the same whether the body is there or not. I said, you're wrong. He said, I'm sorry. Then he hung up. I sat in my kitchen with the winter light coming through the window. I looked at the photo of Margaret Holloway smiling in her office. I looked at the forged check. I looked at the deed with the block printed G, and I made a decision. I flew to Tampa the following week. I rented a car and drove to the address Aunt Patricia gave me. It was a small funeral home, white columns, a sign that read Croft Funeral Services. I walked in. A woman at the front desk smiled. Can I help you? I said, I'm here to see Margaret Croft. She's expecting me. The woman's smile flickered. She disappeared into a back office. A minute later, Margaret Croft appeared. She was older than the photograph, gray streaking her hair, but the same eyes. She said, Catherine, I've been waiting for you. I wasn't sure you'd come. I said, you stole my father's grave. She said, I stole a piece of land. Your father's grave is wherever his ashes were scattered, and I know where that is. She told me that after my father died, my mother had him cremated. She never told me. She said she couldn't afford a full burial, so she had him cremated and kept the urn in her bedroom closet for 3 years. In 2013, she asked Margaret, then still working at the cemetery, to scatter the ashes in the garden behind the office. Margaret did. She said, your mother stood there and watched. She cried. Then she had the headstone placed on the empty plot because she couldn't face telling anyone she had no grave to visit. I stared at her. She said, I'm not proud of what I did, but I gave your mother a place to mourn. The plot was a lie. The headstone was a lie, but the mourning was real, and that's more than she had before. I didn't know what to feel, rage, relief, something in between. I said, you forged signatures, you stole from a dead woman's estate, you're still profiting from this. She said, I'm not. I took the money from Alina's estate because the estate was going to be absorbed by the state. She had no heirs. I used it to buy the plot. I paid the fees out of my own pocket after that. The funeral home is legitimate. I haven't committed a crime since 2012. I said, except you're still using a dead woman's name to own a plot you never legally owned. She said, legally, the plot belongs to Alina Vance. But Alina Vance doesn't exist, so it belongs to no one, and your mother has a headstone she can visit. Sometimes the law is a poor substitute for peace. I walked out. I didn't know what to do next. I had uncovered a decade of lies, but the truth was more complicated than I expected. My mother wasn't a victim. She was a participant in her own deception. Margaret was a thief who also gave my mother a place to cry. The cemetery director was a coward who let it happen, and my father, he was a man who gambled away his family's security and died before he could fix it. I went back to the rental car and sat there for a long time. Then I called my mother. I said, I know about the ashes. She didn't answer. She just breathed. I said, I'm coming home. We need to talk about what you want me to do with the truth. She said, I don't know what the truth is anymore. I said, neither do I, but I know it's not the story you told me. I drove back to the airport with the funeral home shrinking in my rearview mirror. The flight home gave me 4 hours to sit with everything. I landed at midnight. My mother was waiting in the living room, the same room where she'd told me the partial truth weeks before. She looked like she hadn't slept since I left. I sat across from her. I said, I know about the ashes. I know you asked Margaret to scatter them in the garden. I know you've been keeping that secret for a decade. She nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap. She said, I didn't know how to tell you. Every time I tried, the words wouldn't come. I said, so you let me believe he was buried? You let me stand at that headstone and talk to dirt that didn't hold him? She said, it held me. That's what I needed. I needed a place to go. I know it was wrong, but I didn't know how to be a widow without a grave. I let the silence sit. Then I said, Margaret is still operating a funeral home in Florida. She forged documents. She stole from a dead woman's estate. Arthur Pendleton covered for her. I have evidence. I can go to the county prosecutor tomorrow. My mother's face went pale. She said, if you do that, they'll open an investigation. They'll dig up every record. They'll find your father's debt. They'll find the embezzlement from the plant. They'll find the lies I told the bank. I will lose everything. I said, you didn't commit fraud. She said, I committed silence. And silence in a family is the same as conspiracy. I looked at her. The overhead light made shadows under her eyes. She was 63 years old, carrying a husband's debt, a daughter's anger, and a decade of solitude. I said, "What do you want me to do?" She stood up, she walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a small wooden box. She set it on the coffee table between us. Inside was a glass urn. She said, "These are the ashes I told Margaret to scatter." She didn't scatter them. She gave them back to me the next day. She said she couldn't do it. She said it felt wrong, so I kept them. I put the urn in the closet. I told myself I would scatter them someday. I never did. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't ready. Maybe because if I let go of the ashes, I had to let go of the lie, and the lie was the only thing holding me together. I stared at the urn, my father's remains, in a closet for 10 years. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cool. I said, "Where do you want to scatter them now?" My mother said, "I don't know. I don't think it matters to him anymore. I think it matters to us." I thought about the garden behind the cemetery office, the place where Margaret was supposed to leave him. I said, "What about the headstone?" She said, "It's still there. I paid for it. It's not legally his grave, but it's the only marker he has." I said, "I want to fix the deed. I want to make the plot legally ours." She looked at me. That would require going through the county. It would require Arthur Pendleton to correct the records. It would require Margaret to admit what she did. I said, "I know, but I don't want to live with a fraud. I want to live with the truth, even if it's harder." She was quiet for a long time, then she nodded. The next morning, I called Arthur Pendleton. I said, "Mr. Pendleton, I have a proposal. I will not file a complaint with the state licensing board if you do two things. First, you will correct the county records for Plot 47. Section C, you will file a retroactive transfer showing my mother as the legal owner. Second, you will provide written documentation that the original transfer to Alina Vance was an administrative error and that my mother has been the de facto owner since 2012. He said, "I can't do that without involving the county." I said, "You can file a correction of error. It happens all the time. Cemeteries correct records retroactively. The county rarely investigates." He said, "What about Margaret?" I said, "Margaret is your problem. I don't care what you do about her. But if I ever find out she's still using a forged deed to collect fees, I will go to the Florida Licensing Board." He was silent. Then he said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by Friday." I called Margaret Croft that afternoon. She answered. I said, "I'm not going to report you to the Florida board, but I want you to know that I have copies of everything. The check, the photograph, the forged deed, I'm keeping them. If you ever use Alina Vance's name again for any purpose, I will release them to every news outlet in Tampa." She said, "I understand." I said, "And I want you to write a letter to my mother. A full account of what you did, signed." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because she deserves to hear it from you. Not from a headstone, not from a garden, from you." She said, "I'll do it." Then she paused. She said, "Catherine, I know you don't believe me, but I am sorry. I didn't set out to hurt your family. I set out to bury my mother. I made terrible choices. I live with them every day." I said, "I believe you're sorry. That doesn't change what you did, but it's a start." I hung up. 3 weeks later, the paperwork arrived from Arthur Pendleton. The county had approved the correction. Plot 47, Section C was now legally owned by my mother. The Alina Vance entry was expunged. The headstone could stay. I drove to the cemetery with my mother. We stood in front of the stone, my father's name, the dates, the same granite, but now it meant something different. It wasn't a lie. It was a marker for the man who had been scattered in a garden, kept in a closet, and finally, after 10 years, brought to rest. We brought the urn. My mother opened it. She scattered a handful of ashes at the base of the headstone. Then she handed me the urn. I scattered the rest in a line along the edge of the plot. The wind took some of it. The grass held the rest. We stood there in silence. Then my mother said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." I said, "I know." She said, "Can you forgive me?" I looked at the headstone, then at her. I said, "I think I need time, but I'm willing to take it." She nodded. She took my hand. We walked back to the car. That night, I opened the yellow folder one last time. I took out the forged deed, the check, the photograph of Margaret. I put them in a fireproof box. I closed the lid. I didn't burn them. I didn't bury them. I just put them away because some truths are too heavy to throw out and too important to forget. I still don't know everything about my father. I don't know the full scope of his debt. I don't know why my mother chose lies over honesty for so long. But I know that the headstone is real now, and I know that grief isn't a crime that needs a witness. Sometimes it's just a quiet walk between two people who are trying to find their way back to each other. And sometimes the truth takes 10 years to arrive, but when it does, you don't get to choose how it looks. You only get to choose what you do with it. I think about that cemetery garden sometimes. The one where my father was supposed to be scattered. The one where Margaret was supposed to let him go. She couldn't do it. She handed the urn back to my mother and walked away. That moment changed everything. If she had scattered those ashes, my mother would have had nothing left to carry. No urn in the closet, no reason to keep the lie alive, but Margaret couldn't finish it. And that single failure, that small act of conscience, kept the truth buried for another decade. There's a question I still ask myself. If I had never found that deed, would I still be standing at a stranger's grave every Mother's Day? Would my mother still be visiting a headstone that marked nothing? Would the silence have just continued until one of us died and the secret died with us? I don't know, but I know that the truth has a way of surfacing. It doesn't matter how deep you bury it. It doesn't matter how many signatures you forge or how many records you seal. The truth waits. And when it's ready, it finds the one person willing to look. My mother and I are still learning how to be honest with each other. It's not easy. Some days we talk for hours, other days we sit in the same room and say nothing. But the urn is no longer in the closet. The ashes are in the ground now at the base of a headstone that finally belongs to us. It took 10 years, a forged deed, a dead woman's name, and a cemetery director's silence to get there. It took a lot of things I wish had never happened, but we got there. If this story made you think about your own family, your own buried truths, I want to ask you something. What are you not looking at? What deed is sitting in your attic waiting for you to open it? The answer might be painful, it might unravel everything you thought you knew, but the alternative is standing at a stranger's grave for 10 years, crying tears that belong to someone else. The truth doesn't ask for permission, it just asks for courage. Thank you for walking through this with me. If you want to see more stories like this, there's one linked in the description that I think will stay with you. Subscribe if you believe that some truths are worth the wait. I'll see you next time.